Let me introduce now Jonathan Granoff, who will take the rest of this program in hand. Jonathan is co-chair of our Committee on Arms Control and National Security and is certainly an expert in arms control matters. He's also the president of the Global Security Institute and vice president of the NGO Committee on Disarmament at the UN. He serves on numerous governing and advisory boards, such as the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, the Lawyers Alliance for World Security, the Bipartisan Security Group, and the Middle Powers Initiative. He's an award-winning screenwriter, a prolific writer on security issues, and has lectured extensively all over the world, emphasizing the legal, ethical, and spiritual dimensions of human development and security. Jonathan Granoff.
Well, I want to first start out thanking Josh for helping to preside over what has been and will continue to be, I think, one of the most stimulating, substantive, and exciting conferences that the International Law Section has had. I also want to thank Michael Biowitz and his and all the people in his law firm, David Schwartz, for doing an extraordinary amount of just meticulous work to make sure that this would run smoothly. And I also want to thank Jennifer Dobson, who not only doesn't seem to sleep, but is able to remain graceful under pressure. This is a true honor to be able to introduce two of our countries and the world's senior statesmen, people who have lived through some of the most important tragedies and triumphs of the 20th century. Two men who have helped create the world as we know it today, who helped create institutions of commerce, institutions of culture, institutions of security. And, you know, it would normally be somewhat presumptuous to have a title of a gathering, Lessons from a Century for the Next Century. But as I reflected on how to title this discussion, I didn't think we should hold them to a standard of anything less than that, because they're capable of speaking to us at that level. Ted Sorensen was the former special counsel and advisor to President Kennedy. He's a widely published author on the presidency and foreign affairs. He's practiced international law for over 34 years as a senior partner, where he is now of counsel at Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. He's the former chair of the firm's international practice. He's been to over 75 countries, had meetings and negotiations with over 50 heads of government and state. He's advised numerous governments in commerce and international affairs, ranging from the late President Sadat of Egypt to former President Mandela of South Africa. He's a director of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Century Foundation, author of 7 books. In the 1990s, President Clinton appointed him to the board of the Central Asian American Enterprise Fund, covering Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. He was a commission on the White House Fellows. He's experienced in the ways of the United Nations, the World Bank, aid. It's just an amazing, it's more than a resume. It's like a history of the 20th century's major institutions. For our purposes, he was a graduate of the University of Nebraska College of Law, where he was Phi Beta Kappa, Order of the Coif, and of course editor-in-chief of the Law Review. And he is the father of 4 children, 5 grandchildren, and I am pleased to say that I'm a friend of his very distinguished wife, Gillian Sorensen, who was until recently the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. And she is now an advocate for the United Nations with the United Nations Fund. Robert McNamara, well, I never thought that we'd actually get to add this to your resume here, has now recently become a movie star. But before that aspect of his public career, I just want to, he was born in San Francisco. He graduated from the University of California in 1937. In 1939, he received his MBA from Harvard. And then in 1940, he returned to Harvard, where he was an assistant professor of business administration. Then in 1943, he was captain in the Air Force, and he served in India, the United Kingdom, China, and the South Pacific. He was awarded the Legion of Merit and promoted to lieutenant colonel. After his discharge from the Air Force, he joined the Ford Motor Company. He was elected as a director, and then he became the president of the Ford Motor Company. Then at the request of President-elect Kennedy, he was the Secretary of Defense, and he held that position until 1968. And then he became the president of the World Bank. So his active career there stretches from the major program to promote a sustainable development in the developing world to the high office in the White House and Secretary of Defense. And I find it extraordinary that he also was the chief executive officer of the Ford Motor Company. Now, since this time, he actually has, I think, become as active as any person that I've ever met. Every time I speak with Secretary McNamara, he's off to some exotic place to work on some project for which he will never gain public credit. Just last week he was in Uganda working on a development project. And he's just persistently trying to elevate the role of the public servant and to encourage others to a life of service. So without further ado, and these accolades are insufficient when you consider, when I consider how much the generosity of their time, instead of just sitting and resting on their laurels, their time is completely taken up with promoting the public good. So I want to begin and to ensure that we get right to the heart of the matter at the beginning so that we'll remember it, and at the end we're probably going to reiterate it so that it will stick with everybody. I'm going to ask each of our guests to explain to us two of the most important lessons for the 21st century that they have gleaned from their experience in the 20th century. Mr. Sorensen?
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm pleased to be here with you, with this distinguished group, whom I had the honor of addressing 9 years ago. I believe I was the keynote speaker at this meeting in New York. Any of you who were present at that meeting who were unhappy that I was critical of the Clinton administration and its attitude toward multilateralism will be pleased that I will be equally critical today toward the Bush administration and its attitude toward multilateralism. But I'm particularly happy to be here with my friend of more than 50 years, more than 40 years, almost 50, Bob McNamara. We agreed at breakfast that we would divide up the subject. He's going to talk about the fog of war, and I'm going to talk about the sunshine of peace. In terms of two lessons from the 20th century, I would say the first is where this group plays such an important role, and that is, I strongly believe from my experience in the 20th century, whether we're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Berlin Crisis or U.S. role in the United Nations or my own work as an international lawyer, I strongly believe we found out in the 20th century that the United States, more than any other country in the world, depends upon a world of law, depends upon a world in which there are rules under which our investments can prosper, under which our tourists and our people are secure, under which nations can work together, whether it's on postal and television and air lanes or on just the simplest matters of international relations and trade. The United States, because it has a global reach, because it has a greater reach than any other country, needs more than any other country that rule of law, that world of law. And we're learning today with terrorism and all the troubles continuing to mount in the Middle East and elsewhere, that it's a difficult world indeed if law does not prevail. The second lesson is closely related to the first, and that is that whatever the United States needs to do in this world, it can't do it alone. Unilateralism is the most short-sighted, self-destructive policy I could imagine for the United States of America, whether we are talking about making the world a safer place for the United States and for democracy in general, whether we are talking about combating global environmental and health problems, whether we are talking about problems of international crime, terrorism, whatever it is, the United States cannot conquer or even manage those problems in a world as tight and small as this one if we act alone. I was at a meeting last night where one commentator said two words that would never have escaped the lips of President Bush a year or two ago were the words Lakhdar Brahimi. And now he's praising Mr. Brahimi, the United Nations representative, in trying to find a solution in Iraq. And it's another reminder, and certainly our president needs a reminder. We cannot do it alone. So those are my two lessons, and I'll be glad to amplify any of them as you suggest, Jonathan.
Thank you, Ted. Bob?
First, it's a delight to be back with Ted again. One of my great memories and pleasures of my years as secretary was associating with him. He had more influence with President Kennedy than any other human being alive, with a possible exception. I don't know there was an exception of Bobby Kennedy. And we all owe him a tremendous amount. I want to begin by one of my two lessons is his second lesson. We are the strongest nation in the world today, economically, politically, militarily. I think we'll continue to be for decades ahead. But I do not believe we should ever use that power unilaterally with the except in the unlikely contingency of a necessity to defend continental U.S., Hawaii, or Alaska. Very unlikely. If we'd followed that rule, we wouldn't have been in Vietnam. There wasn't one single major ally that supported our action in Vietnam. Not Britain, France, Germany, Japan. And needless to say, this is a lesson we as a people haven't learned. I could be very critical of President Bush on unilateralism, but I think we should recognize it's not just President Bush, it's the American people. We're unilateralists. We think we're good people. I think we're good people. We saved Europe twice militarily. We saved them economically with the Marshall Plan. We do more in our share, so people believe, in financing development across the world. That belief is totally wrong. We do about, in relation to GDP, about 25% as much as the average OECD nation. But we think we're good people, and by God, if we have a plan, it's right, and the rest of the world should follow. We're wrong. They shouldn't and they won't. We better understand that. My second lesson has to do with nuclear weapons. And in a sense, all of you. Our nuclear policy today, and NATO's nuclear policy today, is roughly what it's been for the last 40 years. It's insane. Absolutely insane. And if you doubt that, push your questions to me, and I think I'll try to convince you, and I believe I can. Our current policy is immoral. It's illegal. Every one of you in this room that's a lawyer should be focused on that. And if you believe, as I do, that it's illegal, say so. For God's sakes, tell our people it's illegal. It's militarily unnecessary. Today, as has been true for 40 years, we refuse to state we will follow a policy of no first use. Instead, we say we will initiate the use of nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear state or a nuclear state whenever we believe it's in our interest to do so. As I suggest, that's morally wrong, it's illegal, it's militarily unnecessary. In the 40 years I've been working on the subject of nuclear weapons and nuclear war, I've never seen a piece of paper that stated how the U.S. could initiate the use of nuclear weapons against either a nuclear state or a non-nuclear state with advantage to itself. I've made that statement before NATO defense ministers. I'm thinking of a particular meeting in Norway when I said that. Before SACEURs, the Supreme Allied Commanders in Europe, the highest military officials. Nobody has ever refuted it. Now, if you can't put down on a piece of paper how we can ever use nuclear weapons advantageously, why do we have today some 2,000 on 15-minute alert ready to be launched on decision of one human being without consultation with anyone? It's absurd. It's insane. It's very, very dangerous. Every one of you should be concerned about it. I have some other lessons. We'll come to those later.
Thank you. Well, not only do we have several thousand on alert, but there are several thousand pointed at us as we sit here.
That's right. Exactly.
And it is exactly that principle of power, which is as the most powerful does, so shall others do, that I wanted to delve into with you, which goes to one of the issues that I've heard you speak about, Ted, the doctrine of preemption. And why that is dangerous. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about the doctrine of how you've come to that conclusion from particular experiences in which the doctrine of preemption could have rationally been used, and an instance in which people of good faith, loyalty to America, caring about the world, were propounding the use of the doctrine of preemption in the 20th century, and how that should advise us now.
Well, let me say several things. I am totally opposed to the doctrine of preemption. I'm not totally opposed to the United States or some other country when it has absolute certain knowledge that it is about to be the target of enemy weapons of mass destruction, taking action to prevent that from happening. I'm not certain that our president, famous for his command of the English language, knows the difference between prevention and preemption. But if we have learned anything at all from the 9/11 Commission hearings, we have learned that we are never absolutely certain. Intelligence is an imperfect art and science. Both those favoring our situation on 9/11 and those investigating it have said, well, after all, there's no way of knowing with any precision how or where or when we might be struck or with what weapons. True. But how in heaven's name then can we have a doctrine of preemptive strike, unilateral preemptive strike, if we can't be certain? President Bush said in the fall of 2002 that President Kennedy had said we no longer live in an age when we can wait for weapons of mass destruction to be delivered upon us or to be ready for actual firing before we can act. Well, it's true President Kennedy said those words, but he said them in a totally different context, and that speech rather cleverly took them out of context. Because President Kennedy said it in his report to the nation on the evening of October 22nd, 1962, about the existence of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from our shore, and reporting to the American people and to the world that he had selected not a preemptive strike, as urged upon him, as Bob well remembers, by some in the military and others, to conduct a so-called surgical strike against these Soviet missile sites in Cuba, that he was instead initiating what we called a quarantine, others, lawyers might have called a blockade of Cuba, in which the Soviets called high seas piracy, to prevent more nuclear weapons or more offensive weapons and equipment and supplies from reaching Cuba. That was President Kennedy's way of drawing the line, of making Soviet Chairman Khrushchev understand that we were not going to accept this situation, that he had better reconsider his gamble and his options, because the United States was determined upon those missiles being withdrawn. But we were not, even though they were 15 minutes away, we were not going to launch a preemptive strike, because we knew that would trouble much of the world, because it was dubious international law. It would kill innocent civilians at the site. It would antagonize all of Latin America if we launched an attack on a small Caribbean island without notice. As Bobby Kennedy said, it was Pearl Harbor in reverse. And it would alarm the world generally, because a preemptive strike sets a precedent that once the United States takes it, almost any other country can follow. India will say it needs to strike Pakistan before Pakistan uses its nuclear weapons. Or the Chinese will need to strike Taiwan, or the North Koreans may say they need to strike the United States. Who knows who will be next to launch a preemptive strike in a world where the United States ignores both international law and moral law by pursuing that kind of policy. Certainly that was not the policy that President Kennedy was advocating, and I resent the fact that his words, which I had something to do with, were quoted in support of that policy.
Thank you.
Let me add to what Ted has just said, all of which I agree with. I think President Kennedy had a view that a primary responsibility of the president, as a matter of fact, I'd rephrase it. I think he believed that the primary responsibility of the president, any president, was to keep the nation out of war, if at all possible. And he was determined to do that. The Bay of Pigs was an absolute debacle. The operation had been planned by the Eisenhower administration. The Kennedy administration carried it out. I'm not trying to put the responsibility on Eisenhower. But it was an absolute debacle. But at the end, President Kennedy could have prevented that by accepting the recommendations of the Joint Chiefs and the CIA. It was a CIA operation. And they strongly recommended that we save the Cubans that were trying to overthrow Castro by utilizing available U.S. aircraft power, which we could have done. And the president consciously and determinedly said, absolutely not. He'd said it beforehand, by the way, but he said it again at the end when it could have saved him from a debacle, a very costly political decision. But he was determined to keep the nation out of the war. Later in that same year, in the fall of 1961, I doubt that many of you realized we came very, very close to war with the Soviet Union. They were trying to take West Berlin. And I won't go into the details, but at one point, I asked the SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, General Norstad, to come to Washington and tell me how the crisis would evolve. And he said, they do A, we do B, they do C, we do D, they'll do E. And I said, what do we do then? He said, well, I don't know. We may have to use nuclear weapons. Now, it was that serious a situation. The president was determined to avoid war. We did. On Vietnam, on October 2nd, 1962, he made a decision that we would plan to withdraw all U.S. military before the end of 1965, taking out 1,000 before the end of 1962.
63, Bob.
Pardon me?
63.
I'm sorry, 63, October 2nd, 1960. Thanks, Ted. And he was determined to do that, and he would have done it. He never, in my opinion, would have been responsible for putting 500,000 men in Vietnam. I can remember that early in his presidency, General Max Taylor and Walt Rostow were sent to Vietnam to examine what should be done. They came back and recommended that we introduce, as I remembered, a U.S. military division. He said, absolutely not. So I think this is a very important point to understand. It was a major, major policy underlying all of his actions. And it saved us from a nuclear war. We came that close. We can talk more about Cuba if you're interested. And it saved us from other military operations.
You've spoken with Castro about how close we came. What did he say?
Well, let me just take one moment then, if you want
Please.
to talk about Cuba and Castro. At 4 p.m., correct me if I get the year wrong now. I know the date. The date was October 27th. 4 p.m. Saturday, October 27, 1962. That's right. And at that moment, the president was presiding over a meeting of his executive committee, his closest military and civilian associates were dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis that Ted referred to. And at that moment, the CIA said, of course we had the photographs of the missiles, but the CIA said they did not believe any nuclear warheads had been delivered to the island of Cuba. They thought the first batch of 20 were coming on a ship named the Vltava and would be there in about 3 or 4 days. The Joint Chiefs, having somewhat reluctantly supported, as Ted said, called it the quarantine. We didn't use the word blockade because blockade was a word of art that connoted military action. We didn't want to connote military action. Anyhow, we had the quarantine. It didn't seem to be working. Khrushchev wasn't moving to get those missiles out. They had to be got. So the chiefs recommended unanimously at 4 p.m. that we strike, attack, and within 2 or 3 days, before the nuclear warheads arrived. The first day's airstrike was planned at 1,080 sorties, a huge air attack, larger than any attack on Kosovo, for example. We had 180,000 troops mobilized with the necessary shipping in southeast U.S. ports. They recommended attack. It wasn't until 29 years later, at a meeting in Cuba chaired by Castro in January 1992, that we learned at that particular moment of Saturday, 4 p.m. 1962, that there were 160 nuclear warheads on the soil of Cuba, roughly 90 tactical warheads to be used against an invasion force, and roughly 70 to be used on the missiles targeted on 90 million Americans on the East Coast. That's how close we came. Kennedy, of course, said no. But I put this to Castro. I said, Mr. Castro, President, were you aware at that time that the nuclear warheads were on the soil of Cuba? And if so, would you have recommended to Khrushchev that he use them in the event of a U.S. attack? And thirdly, what would have happened to Cuba if he did? And he said, number one, I was aware of it. Number two, I would not have recommended. I did recommend it to Khrushchev. And we know later that's what happened in a cable that went out, I think, on Thursday night before this Saturday. I did recommend that he use them in the event of an attack. And number three, what would have happened in Cuba? It would have totally disappeared. And he said, Mr. McNamara, that's what you would have done if you and President Kennedy would have done if the U.S. had been in that position. I said, my God, Mr. President, I hope we would not have. And knowing the President's side did, I'm sure we would not have. But that's how close we came.
Shall I jump in here?
I'd like you to, about how we can avoid this in the future.
Well, let me just add a few comments about how close we came, because what Bob says is exactly right. Castro, through the Soviet ambassador to Havana, did send that message. The wording of the message, which has since become available, was, Mr. Khrushchev, I am certain the Americans are coming. I'm certain they're going to invade the next 24 or 48 hours. And when they do, I plead with you to use those medium-range nuclear missiles that you have on our island and eliminate this threat to world society and peace forever. It so happens that in this strange, unpredictable world of ours, that message from Castro coincided with word reaching Khrushchev that his own commander on Cuba had authorized the use of a surface-to-air missile to shoot down a U.S. reconnaissance plane, and Khrushchev had not given that order. He felt things were getting out of control. The message from Castro alarmed him that Khrushchev had set in motion some doomsday course here, and it helped persuade him to give a favorable answer to the letter that President Kennedy sent him that our time Saturday evening. As some of you know, Bob, when he talked about the 92 meeting, was talking about one of a series of so-called reunions, unique in world history, that had been held by the veterans of the Cuban Missile Crisis from all three governments, the American, the Soviet, and the Cuban government. And we had another one a year and a half ago in Cuba. And Mr. Castro is still going strong. On the first day of the conference, was kind enough to invite some of the American participants, including Bob and me, to a nice lunch. And everything was quite jovial, and there were a lot of toasts. So I stood up, and in my toast, I chided Mr. Castro for wanting to eliminate this threat to world society forever. And he said, well, that was only if the invasion started. He amended my toast to add that condition. But then I went ahead and thanked him anyway, because it had so alarmed Chairman Khrushchev that his letter contributed to the peace. But I also want to circle back to what we first were talking about, which is the need for allies. Even though Cuba was an American problem and the Europeans thought we were obsessed with Cuba, we wanted allies. We took the problem to the United Nations, and President Kennedy sent out high-level emissaries to brief the British Prime Minister, the German Chancellor, the French President, and the NATO Council. And Dean Acheson, the most eminent and distinguished of all our emissaries, called upon French President de Gaulle likely to be the most difficult of our allies in that situation. And Atchison went in and presented President Kennedy's statement and the argument why we felt action was necessary. And he then said to de Gaulle, as you may have all heard this recently because Zbig Brzezinski has been citing this as a counterpoint to what's going on these days. And Atchison said, out in your waiting room, I have an American Army colonel who will bring in and explain to you the actual photographs of the Soviet missiles in Cuba. The weapons of mass destruction were not mysteries, and the United States was not reluctant to share evidence with its allies. And Atchison made that offer, and de Gaulle, not all that friendly to America most of the time, said, no, that won't be necessary. The word of the American president is good enough for me. I wonder if that would happen today.
Talking about the importance of multilateralism, I wanted to propose that going into the 21st century, that on a number of issues, it is an absolute imperative that there is no way that any one country nor any group of countries can deal with ensuring biodiversity and ending the destruction of thousands of species, reversing the depletion of fishing stocks, controlling ocean dumping, preventing ozone depletion, halting global warming, controlling and eliminating terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, fighting pandemic diseases, and ending the tragedy of crushing poverty, lack of clean drinking water, and addressing crisis arising from failed states. That each of these problems require universal solutions. And the greatest divide in the world right now, I think, is the divide between the countries that claim the right to possess and threaten to use weapons of mass destruction, claim a moral and security right to do that, and the rest of the world. So I wanted, and that this divide of nuclear apartheid affects the perception of the whole world as to whether we are all equal citizens of the planet. So Secretary McNamara, I wanted you to really go into depth on this particular divide of the nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots and how we might address this critical issue.
The 8 who possess nuclear weapons, the 8 declared nuclear powers, or 5 declared nuclear powers, plus the 3 others who possess nuclear powers, and particularly the U.S. attitude, is breaking down the nonproliferation regime, which has protected us against further proliferation for over 40 years. And this is one of the most serious problems the U.S. faces in the world today. The Nonproliferation Treaty has been very, very important in assuring that other nations would not develop nuclear powers. That is breaking down with every passing day. And a major reason it's breaking down is that we say to other nations, we need nuclear weapons. You don't, we're not going to allow you to have them. We are the strongest conventional power in the world. Other nations not possessing nuclear weapons face opponents whom they fear. And they believe their conventional forces are inadequate to protect them against those opponents. And therefore, if we continue on this course, they will move to nuclear weapons. I'm absolutely positive of that. North Korea is a good illustration. We are in the deepest of trouble with North Korea today. It's far more dangerous than Iraq or Iran. A friend who is very knowledgeable stated he believes that they have 6 nuclear weapons. The New York Times, 2 or 3 days ago, published a statement that Khan, the Pakistani, who provided nuclear expertise to many nations, stated that he believed he saw 3 nuclear weapons in North Korea a few years ago. The CIA says they think they have 1 or 2. If Khan saw 3 or 4 years ago, they can surely have 6 today. What are we going to do? There's no military answer to that. It's as though North Korea had 2,000 artillery tubes at LaGuardia focused on Manhattan. That's the situation that Seoul is in, and our troops are in. It's a military horror to think about what would happen if we attacked North Korea. But there will be, we've got to deal with North Korea, there will be more North Koreas if we allow the Nonproliferation Treaty to break down. It is breaking down. Article 6 of that treaty provides that the 5 declared nuclear powers will engage responsibly to negotiate elimination of all their nuclear weapons. I don't believe that any U.S. president or chairman of the Joint Chiefs or Secretary of Defense ever intended to do that. But that's the law. That's in the treaty. The treaty was ratified by the Senate. It is the law. We're not abiding by it. Other nations will move as North Korea has. What are we going to do? We have no answer. When I say we, I mean the U.S. The U.S. policy is preemption, military preemption, regime change. That is not going to work. The UN Security Council has no action, has no policy. What are we going to do? It's an unanswered question, but you should worry about it. Phrased somewhat differently, the primary lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis is that the indefinite combination of human fallibility, and as Ted said, intelligence is uncertain. You must build into your decision-making process the recognition of uncertainty. Human beings are fallible. And the common wisdom is, conventional wisdom is, don't make the same mistake twice. Well, maybe we make it 3 times or 4 times, and we don't make it 5 or 6. There's a learning period. There isn't going to be any learning period with nuclear weapons. You make one mistake, nations will be destroyed. We must move to eliminate it. It's a legal requirement, it's a moral requirement, and it's a military necessity.
People don't realize that the entire budget for all the international atomic energy inspectors has never exceeded $100 million in any given year for the whole planet. And our country today spends in excess of $100 million to keep our nuclear, only our country alone, in excess of $100 million a day to keep the nuclear arsenal at the ready. And according to the Brookings Institute, we've spent over $5.7 trillion without any national debate or discussion to respond to Secretary McNamara's challenge as to what we might do about it. It's interesting when we talk about solutions to this question. France and the United Kingdom and all of our allies have called for creating an inspection capacity to deal with weapons of mass destruction through the UN, to extend UNMAVIC and institutionalize it. And we're the only major country objecting to this. And it's largely because of the issue of unilateralism and multilateralism. Secretary McNamara, you had written in the New York Times an op-ed in December of 2000 in strong support for the International Criminal Court, which I think is one of the great steps forward to promote the rule of law, as you opened up with. So, Ted, I wondered if you could talk about the importance of the International Criminal Court in the context of binding the world together under the rule of law.
Just sitting here thinking that the most eloquent speech of the 20th century was Martin Luther King's I have a dream speech. I'd like to give a speech sometime about I never dreamed. As an American lawyer who believes that the rule of law is so essential to America's best interest, I never dreamed that the United States would lead the fight against the International Criminal Court, which is so important to our security. As an American citizen, proud that we helped in a bipartisan fashion to establish the United Nations in 1945. I never dreamed that the United States would join rogue states in defying and disdaining and bypassing the United Nations in one instance after another. I certainly never dreamed that we would have an administration and a Department of Defense talking about continuing the nuclear arms race by building what they now call, bunker busters or something, a new kind of nuclear weapon just to spur other countries to build their nuclear arsenals. It's incredibly against our best interests.
I strongly agree with Ted on that. We have basically two deterrents to actions we don't wish to see take place in the international arena. One is economic sanctions. They're relatively ineffective. I think they did contribute to the end of apartheid in South Africa, but they failed
They also
on
had
numerous
more
occasions. And the other, of course, is military action. And it's a very, very crude weapon, and we should avoid it if at all possible. I think we should try to fashion a third, and this is something Ted is an authority on, and all of you, or most of you, are extremely interested in and authorities on as well, and that is to fashion what I call a judicial deterrent. In 3 years in the Army Air Corps and 7 years as secretary, I never saw a piece of paper that said what was legal versus illegal in either initiating military operations or in carrying them out. I understand that that situation has changed somewhat, and I was told that today in Iraq, every military command down to the division level has associated with the commander a representative of the Judge Advocate General who reviews the proposed airstrikes or other combat operations for, quote, legality, unquote. I think that's a major step forward. But we should go beyond that. And we should try to develop an accepted code of conduct. And then we should develop mechanisms to enforce that code. And of course, the foundation of the mechanism would be the International Criminal Court. This is why I have supported it today. And by the way, you might be interested. The Chief Justice of the International Criminal Court asked to see a copy of The Fog of War, the movie. So I went over 2 or 3 weeks ago and presented it to his court, and he had invited the justices of 2 other international courts in The Hague. And they were very, very interested in it because it raises this issue of criminal conduct in relation to initiating war and carrying out war. I think all of you as lawyers and all of us who are interested in peace should think about this and try to establish what I call the judicial deterrent. I was immensely impressed by what I saw in The Hague and what I heard them talk about. If that court can function for 25 years, there's going to be a body of law that my successors, civilian authorities relating to war, deciding in relation to war, and military leaders are going to recognize they have to abide by. And if they don't abide by it, they're going to be faced with penalties they will not wish to accept. And that is going to, over time, I hope and believe it can, develop into a deterrent we do not now have.
Ted, could you talk a little bit about the concern of values amongst nations, that, in our interpersonal relations, values and conscience, these are really of primary concern. But amongst nations, should these be part of the concern?
I think they are of concern, and they are of primary concern to the United States. When President Kennedy at American University, June 1963, talked about American values, American generosity, Americans' belief in opportunity, Americans' concern about the misery of others, American being a peace-loving country. In fact, his very words were, "The world knows the United States will never start a war. America's had enough of war." It's pretty tough to say that today. But those values were the American values that he communicated to the world, and in my opinion, that helped protect us. That helped make the world respect us. There was not even then we were the most powerful, richest, but there wasn't the hatred, the resentment that we've heard so much about since 9/11, because the world respected us for our values. We are much safer if we are respected for our values than if we are feared for our military might.
How does that relate to the capacity to see how the others see us, the capacity and the importance of empathy in international
one
relations?
lesson that is a very important lesson I hope I've learned from my relations to international operations is one must develop empathy in relation to one's opponents. And I use the word empathy, not sympathy. They're not synonymous in my mind. By empathy, I simply mean understanding your opponent. Neither we nor the North Vietnamese were empathetic in relation to the other. And that had a major effect on the operations of each of us. In the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, initially, not Russia, not Cuba, not the U.S. was empathetic toward the other. Castro initiated actions to try to subvert established governments in the hemisphere, including, we believe, an attempt to assassinate the elected president of Venezuela, Betancourt. He thought we'd just sit by and let it happen. We initiated the Bay of Pigs action against Castro. Under three presidents, attempts were made to assassinate Castro. We carried out an absolutely stupid covert operation named Mongoose, which Castro was aware of. And we thought he'd do nothing. We surrounded Khrushchev with weapons of mass destruction based in Turkey and numerous other places. We thought he'd do nothing. Each one of the three of us lacked empathy in relation to the other. But President Kennedy, at the critical juncture on that Saturday, he had an empathy toward Khrushchev. He knew Khrushchev was in a god-awful mess, and he had to find a way out, and Kennedy helped him find it. And then he instructed each of us not to boast about winning. We won, but he said, for God's sakes, don't say it. He had an empathy with Khrushchev at that point. It's very, very important. Are we empathetic today in relation to our potential opponents? I don't think so.
The Nobel Peace Laureates issued a statement last year where they took that principle and codified it and said that nations should treat other nations as they want to be treated, as a way of.
It sounds very simplistic, but it's absolutely fundamental, and we often don't do it.
I'd like to open it up for some dialogue with the audience. We have two microphones here. I'm sure that people have some pretty focused questions. Josh?
I'll start it off. Is this on? Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear?
I'll start it off. It's interesting, the last comment that was made about being hungry for justice and the like. And I'd like to ask your perspective on that from the world of the 50s and 60s, because it seems to me that we in the U.S. supported quite a number of regimes that were unjust tyrannical, otherwise oppressive to their peoples in the interest of perhaps stability or other ideals of the U.S. If you reflect back on that, did we take the right course there? Should we have done something differently in retrospect?
You take that one first, Ted?
The answer is yes, we should have done something differently. We were engaged in what we thought was a global competition, not simply military, but political, diplomatic, economic, ideological above all. We did not want other countries on the balance, on the edge of deciding, do they throw in with the Soviet Empire or do they join the West? And so we were looking for allies wherever we could find them. And we made, in my opinion, a lot of mistakes. And we promised assistance and support to some very repressive regimes. And we only added to that sense of injustice in the world. I don't want to get into personal memories here, but for my sins, I introduced Bob McNamara to President Mobutu.
I was
of
just
Congo.
thinking of that.
And,
But I don't blame
I'm sure
you.
he hasn't forgiven me.
I don't blame you. I blame myself because I then supported Mobutu. I am absolutely certain he ordered certain of his cabinet members to be killed, for example. He was one of the most brutal leaders in the world. We supported him. Not because Ted introduced me to him, but because it was part of the Cold War. And we did some awful things, justified in our minds by our belief that the Soviets were determined to weaken the West. That's why we had nuclear weapons. We believed our conventional forces in Europe were so weak that the Warsaw Pact could sweep across Western Europe and take Germany and France and so on. I think we were probably wrong, but that's what we believed. And it was the foundation of many, many erroneous decisions, of which support of Mobutu was one.
Well, let me explain. I was retained by Mobutu at a time that when the United States government thought he was the real hope, that he was going to unify the Congo and prevent the communists from taking it over. And he had just nationalized the copper mines, and the Belgians had informed him that every shipment of copper leaving the Congo was going to be attached, and he realized a little too late that he needed a lawyer to give him some advice. And ultimately, not having been able to work things out, he asked me to bring President of the World Bank, McNamara, out to the Congo to try to mediate the dispute. And Bob manfully agreed to that task and then provided a report that Mobutu didn't like. Mobutu then called me in and said, by what authority did you bring this man McNamara out here? And I said, well, I received word that that is what you wanted me to do. He said, from whom? I said, from your Minister of Finance. He said, you're our lawyer. You should have read our Constitution. Minister of Finance has no power. Only I have power. That was my last service for Mobutu.
And I'll tell you the end of the story. It was clear to Mobutu that I wasn't going to recommend what he wanted done. And he had brought me and my wife in there. It was on a Sunday. As I was getting ready to leave, he said, no, stay a moment. He reached in his pocket and he said, this is for Madame. He opened it. It was a diamond ring. He says, it's 80 carats. I think he had the decimal point in the wrong place. It might have been 8, but it was a huge diamond. I said, Mr. President, you know the President of the World Bank can't accept gifts. can't possibly take it. He says, I paid for it with my own money. It cost $80,000. So I said, I can't take it. You must take it. So he had brought the Zairian ambassador to the U.S. over to be with us then. And I walked out with the ambassador, and as we walked out the front door, I said, God damn it, you take this. You know I can't take gifts. He said, he'll kill me. And he meant it. So I put it in my pocket. I went back to the bank. I told the board of directors I sent the diamond to the embassy. I got a receipt for it. The board understood. Nobody's ever heard of the diamond since.
A simple, short question for both of you, and that's if you were asked today by the President and by the UN for advice on Iraq, what would you advise both? Or either? If you don't want to take the call from the President, I fully understand.
Ted, I couldn't hear. What you would advise the President?
No. Strangely enough, I haven't received a call from the President. But I'll say a little immodestly that without being asked, I have from time to time offered my suggestions to the Secretary General of the UN, a good friend of mine, and I think one of the outstanding leaders in the world today. I do not think that Iraq is a place for UN peacekeepers. I think the United States is looking for a scapegoat because when the June 30 deadline is met, it's a deadline that's related much more to our election cycle than it is to the Iraqi election cycle. When that June 30 deadline is met, chaos is going to ensue, and it will be a very dangerous chaos. The UN has already suffered one mortal blow in, what was it, August of last year, in Iraq, and doesn't deserve another one after being disdained, dismissed, bypassed when the war was initiated in Iraq. I don't think it's the United Nations' responsibility to try to solve, much less police and occupy that mess now. But the United Nations can be helpful in exactly what Mr. Brahimi, a very wise man, is doing. And that is, Brahimi is trying to put together a genuinely Iraqi government that's not handpicked by the United States. That doesn't, its power is not based on the authority of the United States. If Iraqis of all stripes and shades see a government with a police force that owes its authority not to the United States but to the United Nations, then I think that country does have a chance for progress and security. That's the direction in which the UN is headed, and as I indicated earlier in my reference to even President Bush now familiarizing himself with the name of Brahimi, I think the United States, for its own good, is going to accept that. Otherwise, the current turmoil is going to continue for a very long time.
I strongly agree. There's no solution to Iraq that does not involve the UN in a major role, a role far greater in the decision-making process than is fulfilled so far. And hopefully, and I think the events of the last few days have given some hope to believe that it will fulfill that role.
If this questioners, I'm sorry, if you would identify yourselves, please.
I'm Ilmi Granoff, a nascent lawyer. I have a question for Mr. Mr. Sorensen mentioned, actually it's a question for anyone, but Mr. Sorensen mentioned bunker busters. And I'm terrified of the idea of smaller nuclear weapons, and I'm concerned about their implications for the web of international law that maintains global security currently, and their ability to undermine our categorical denial of the legitimacy of nuclear weapons, the idea that these are usable nuclear weapons. If they are created, what need we do to prevent a slippery slope, if anything, in which nuclear weapons are no longer seen as weapons of mass destruction?
Well, if that question is directed at me, certainly nuclear weapons are still weapons of mass destruction. Bob is the true expert, but let me just make one comment. Isn't it ironic that at the same time we are talking about small nuclear weapons which will fit into a suitcase, we are reneging on one of the most important treaties in the whole network of agreements to slow down the nuclear arms race, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, because once again we're back to the Reagan Star Wars days of believing that nuclear weapons are going to come flying through the skies and that we somehow have the scientific and technical ability to separate the real ones from the sham missiles flying through the air and knock them out of the air with these weapons. To renege on that treaty and to start building such a system, whether it works or not, is going to trigger a new multi-billion-dollar arms race when the real threat is going to be small nuclear weapons coming in through a suitcase, not through the skies.
Well, I said our nuclear policy is insane. It is insane. And one evidence of it is just what you're talking about. We are committed, as I say, by law, by Article 6 of the Nonproliferation Treaty, to move responsibly to negotiate elimination of nuclear weapons. And here we are designing two nuclear weapons, the deep penetrating weapon you referred to, and a new tactical nuclear weapon. It's absolutely illegal. There are legal issues here, and you lawyers ought to be addressing them. I understand they're not easy to address, and I understand that the basis for law would be difficult. I read the opinion of the court in The Hague, not the International Criminal Court, but the International Court of Justice on nuclear weapons. I think it's a lousy opinion, but if you haven't read it, read it. Because although they don't say, they stay away from the actual categorical statement that the use of nuclear weapons would be illegal, they say that if they're used, they must be used in accordance with humanitarian law, which requires proportionality and discrimination. I have never seen a plan for the use of nuclear weapons, and I don't want to suggest you couldn't think about how to use one as a depth charge or something. We have thousands of these things. There is no plan on paper for using them that would meet the test of humanitarian law. There's no plan on paper that you lawyers should consider legal. And they ought to say it. The best protection against these two new nuclear weapons, or any nuclear weapons, would be a full debate in the Congress, House and Senate, Senate Armed Services Committee, Foreign Relations Committee, that would expose the whole subject. These subjects have not been debated. They must be. The American people must be educated. You must be educated to the danger we face today. It's a danger to the human race. It's unacceptable to me, with children and grandchildren, for them to confront this world. It will not last indefinitely. The indefinite combination of human fallibility and nuclear weapons will lead to destruction of nations. They'll be used.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Joe Hurd, and I'm coming from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for your time this morning. My question is this, and since I'm in a room full of lawyers, I thought I'd start with the hypothetical situation. Let's assume it's January 2005, and there's been a regime change in the United States in November, or the current administration has a flash of lucidity and grace. My question for you, Mr. Sorensen, returning to your comment about unilateralism to start the conversation, what are the top 3 things you would advise either the current administration or the incoming administration to do to signal to the multilateral community that America is ready to restore its political and moral credibility to the multilateral community? Is it a speech to the United Nations? Is it a trip to President Chirac and giving him a big wet kiss on the cheek? What would you suggest?
I think you've got 2 good suggestions right there. And I would think that in the speech to the United Nations, the new president would announce that we are going to move forward, including, that means the United States Senate, on ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, on ratification of the Biodiversity Treaty. Jonathan, you mentioned that just a few minutes ago. It so happens when I addressed this group in 1995, I mentioned our failure to ratify the Biodiversity Treaty as one of our failures on multilateralism, and we still haven't ratified it. And the same is true in a host of other areas. And I think the United States could do more in terms of its obligations. Bob knows a lot more about this than I do. Not only to the World Bank, but to the International Development Association, IFC, and other development arms, multilateral development arms, to show the world once again that we are aware of the misery out there and we want to do something about it. That would be a turnaround that would not only be in the world's interest, but because it would show a different kind of attitude, to get back to that question of values, toward the rest of the world, I think it would go further to secure our safety and to diminish the recruitment of young terrorists and suicide bombers against us than anything else we could do.
I agree with that. So the first thing I would do would be to increase support for the United Nations. You think, well, this administration has not been supportive of the UN. The American people haven't been supportive of the UN. Those of you who have been close to the UN, closer than perhaps I have, although I had an office there for 13 years, may know more about it than I do. But I can name you 10 or 15 instances where we've failed to support it. And the American people, they'll say they'll support it, but when you come down, do you mean to say, they'll say to me, you mean to say that you would allow the UN to decide when we'll use military force? Are you going to turn over to the UN decisions that are fundamental to U.S. security? We must provide more support for the UN. We must be willing to see it play a more decisive role in preserving the peace across the world. And we must follow it when it does say that peace is at risk. If you want an object lesson of our failure to support the UN, read the chapter by Samantha Powers on Rwanda, Burundi. Genocide. What we could have done and didn't do. In any event, the first point I agree with Ted is support the UN. The second point, and he didn't mention it, but I want to, is increase the quality of life in this country to the level that can be supported by our income per capita. We have the highest income per capita in the world. And in the capital, the richest country, and in Washington, D.C., the infant mortality rate, which is a very good judge, a good measure of health, the infant mortality rate is less than Castro's Cuba. That is a disgrace. I have 6 grandchildren. Their grandparents went to public schools. Their parents went to public. I don't have a 1 in public schools. Maybe we're wrong. I don't think so. It's a disgrace what's happened in many parts of our country on public education. I could go on forever. We just are not buying the quality of life. We're not using our resources properly. I'd do that. And I would certainly do what Ted pointed out on development. This can be done. It's very, very difficult. A major problem on development, which we haven't discussed, and this isn't the venue to do so, is that the leaders of many of these developing countries, the elite of many of the developing countries, are not fulfilling their responsibility to society. The media elite, the political elite, the commercial elite, the academic elite, they are not putting the responsibility to all segments of society, particularly to the poor, at the top of their list of priorities. I could go on, but I'd at least start in those areas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have an abundance of substantive discussion and a dearth of time. And so I want to apologize for the people who are posing questions and try and bunch the next two together and then see where we are after that.
Sure. I have a very brief question. How does the elimination, this is David Schwartz from New York City, how does the elimination of nuclear weapons by the 5 declared nuclear powers reduce the likelihood of nuclear technology falling into the hands of rogue states and potentially being used by them?
Well, we haven't talked much about the danger of the current nuclear policies in the U.S. and the 5 declared powers in relation to rogue states. But as long as we go ahead producing nuclear weapons, fissile materials are being developed by us and by others who will follow us on producing nuclear weapons. And these fissile materials are not properly protected. And it would be very easy, or relatively easy, for a member of a rogue state to obtain access to them. And when they do, they greatly increase the danger to this country of terrorism. For that reason alone, we ought to revise our nuclear policy.
There's a brief on the subject available by the Bipartisan Security Group. It was drafted by a group that included Ambassador Thomas Graham, who negotiated START 1 for George Bush Sr., Bob Gray, who was Ambassador Gray, who helped put together the first Gulf War coalition for George Bush Sr., and several other ambassadors addressing the commitments made to reduce the capacity of nuclear weapons to get out in the world under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. Specifically, it's available in the back. I think we're just going to have time for one more question, and yeah, please. And I deeply apologize.
Scott Fairley from Toronto, Canada. I want to thank both speakers for the lessons they've given us today and invite comment on two in particular. One from Mr. Sorensen, that the United States can't go it alone, and the second from Mr. McNamara on the third option of judicial deterrence. I invite comments from both speakers on the prospects for the United States recommitting to multilateral institutions and whether or not Security Council reform might be a part of that in the United Nations context. And in respect of the theme of judicial deterrence, what will it take for the United States to recommit to the institutions it was instrumental in creating, like the World Court, and then perhaps more interestingly, institutions they've eschewed, like the International Criminal Court, which, of course, Canada has enthusiastically supported. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll begin by saluting Canada for the role it's played in, as the originators under Mike Pearson of international peacekeeping, and as consistently, year in, year out, playing a leading role in the United Nations and setting an example for the world as a whole. I don't give up on the United States returning to the multilateral table and returning to its old standards of peace and understanding abroad. It may take something horrible happening in this country before Americans shake off that American exceptionalism. We're the best, we're the strongest, we're the richest, what do we need other countries for? Something terrible could very well happen to this country. I hope it doesn't. I hope it doesn't take that. I hope new leadership, because this is a country where leadership is so important. Leadership sets the tone. Leadership sets the example. Leadership enables people to realize what their obligations are. President Kennedy was a master at putting in perspective, putting in context what each individual citizen's role could and should be in tackling racial discrimination in this country, but also in meeting our obligations to the rest of the world. But it may take some time.
I think Canada, a relatively small nation, certainly in terms of population, vis-a-vis the U.S., has in the past played a very, very important role in world affairs. I'm thinking of several of your prime ministers who I knew quite well. They played a role that helped the U.S. move in directions which were in the interest of peace in the world. I think Canada can continue to nudge the U.S. in that direction. And I'm relatively optimistic that U.S. policy, which I would characterize as one of unilateralism, will shift. I don't think there's any answer to the Iraqi problem, which is very, very serious today, that does not involve the UN playing a more significant role. I think we've seen in the last 48 hours some evidence of that. I'm very, very hopeful that if we proceed in the direction that it seems to me we're beginning to move in, that will help us in Iraq. And I think if that does occur, that in itself will tend to move the U.S. more toward a multilateralist as opposed to a unilateralist position in the world. I'm very, very hopeful.
Before we come to a close here, I wanted to announce that the Arms Control and National Security Committee will have its meeting at 3 o'clock in the stateroom. We'll have a short meeting between 3 and 3:30 in the stateroom. Now, there's a fabulous book. Our guests have written many books, but this book has particularly helped guide me, called Wilson's Ghost by Secretary McNamara. And it covers many of the subjects we've talked about today. Now, in the book is a quote from a speech by President John F. Kennedy. And since to my right is somebody who helped write those speeches, I thought it would be appropriate to end this part of the session, before I turn it back over to Josh, with this quote. President Kennedy said on June 12th, 1963, "And if we cannot now..."
June 10th.
Is it June 10th?
I got the wrong date. He knows because he drafted that speech. That was one of the greatest speeches President Kennedy ever gave or he ever drafted.
Ted, I would let you read this, but...
and if we cannot resolve or end all our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, we all share the same, we all inhabit the same small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal.
Ted, you're great. You can't see.
You know, I wrote that I'm humbled and awed both by the presence of these eminent statesmen as well as the lessons that we've learned today. But I'm also extremely moved by your presence today and your presentation. It's evident to us that the U.S. does depend on a world of law, and this section is an advocate for the rule of law in the world. And our faith that we are on the right path has surely been renewed by this discussion. Thank you very much for being here, both of you. We very, very much appreciate it. And as a token of our esteem, I'd like to present you with a symbol of this section, which is our globe. Thank you very much.